So in the late 1980s, as these magazine writers and intellectuals and journalists and artists and others are starting to speak up in a way for the first time, was there ever a sense that, oh, wait a minute, we're letting a genie out of the bottle here that we don't want to? Or was there the sense of liberation and enthusiasm that came with that, and sense of possibility was so great that it dwarfed whatever apprehensions the ruling party would have had once they opened this up?
Well, you know, there is initially, I would say probably between 87 and 89, first years, I think nobody, with the exception probably of very few people, including, incidentally, the engineer of Glasnost, the godfather of Glasnost, Alexander Yakovlev, who was the secretary for ideology of the Central Committee, he knew what he was doing. But I think others felt, even the intellectuals, very critical of the regime. I don't think those 2 years, the first 2 years of Glasnost, felt that it's going to destroy the country, or create a political revolution. And by that I mean, in the end, Russia changed its economic system, changed political system, and in fact, it became a new state because the Soviet Union was no more. But at that time, no. I think they were just so intoxicated by the ability to speak their minds freely. That the subversiveness of that was not apparent. But one of the most fascinating things about this is the interplay of ideas and political attitudes. And I think, again, I think I mentioned in the book that this must be among the most rapid impacts of ideas on political attitude. At the end of my first introductory chapter, I think, I actually give the results of public opinion polls. And if in 85 or even 87, if you'd ask an average Russian, do you think that this is the best economic system, the best political system? Even without anybody standing there with a gun to their heads, they probably said yes. I mean, yeah, well, we have problems, we have lines, but other than that, the fascinating part for the historian of ideas in this book is that this was the actually most polled revolution in history. I mean, they were there. They started polling, I think, in early '89, and they continued to poll through '91. And I give the results of some of those polls, and you could see it's incredible how the opinions and the attitudes of millions of people are beginning to switch and change. Do we need many parties? Would that be a good idea? First, of course, no. Then yes. What about the rights of dissenters and people to speak their mind, even if they're a minority, even if they're wrong? Again, a shift to yes, and all the way to including some of the most painful issues, such as the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the so-called domestic empire. Should we keep those republics in that don't want to be in? Again, you see a huge shift. It's tectonic. It's exciting, really, to see this great ship of a multi-million state and people in it sort of beginning to shift, just because of a couple of hundred, essentially, articles in newspapers and magazines.
You mentioned briefly earlier Gorbachev. I want to just come back to him, just have you comment a little bit more. He's central to this story, obviously. There's a sort of a parlor game that we play in the United States about who deserves credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Was it Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and maybe Pope John Paul, or was it Gorbachev, or was it history, or what? And maybe this will evolve even more over time in terms of the perception of Gorbachev's importance. But tell us what you think his importance was.
He was a key. I mean, it's not just my opinion. There was the key, I should say. I quote a few, prominent experts, and essentially they say, and I agree, that had it not been Gorbachev, had Andropov's kidneys been healthy, we probably would still have the Soviet Union. There was absolutely nothing inevitable. Yes, it was an immoral regime. Yes, the economy was creeping along, but it was not bankrupt. I mean, I give the numbers. I mean, there were, it grew 2-3% a year. Yes, people, food was rationed, but so it had been for the previous 50 years. And look at Cuba and North Korea and Saddam, Iraq under Saddam Hussein. You go along.
These things can keep going.
Yeah, forever. As one of the experts says, chronic illnesses are not necessarily fatal. You could just continue to. But what Gorbachev did was two things. And I think one was just a pure moral impulse when he said in January of '87, which is why the book is traced from '87, rather than from his coming to power in April of '85. There was a session of the Central Committee, and he said, "Glasnost and democratization is the road," right? And the second thing is approximately in late '89, early '90, when it became obvious that this is out of control, that the absence of that glasnost essentially is becoming a political revolution, he would not crack down. He had, I believe, a deep moral aversion to terror, and we know actually from his biographies. I mean, both his grandparents on both sides were victims of collectivization, essentially destruction of peasantry in the early 1930s. Of which there is a very sad chapter in this book. Wherever that aversion came, which was strange. I mean, as we speak, Bashar Assad is not averse. I mean, he's ready to kill half of the country to stay in power. So was Stalin, so was Saddam Hussein. I mean, and then somebody gets up there, somehow manages to get up there and believes that there's something, there are moral values above and beyond the preservation of the regime. And I think that's what it was in a nutshell. He felt that and don't try to read his memoirs, he's not a very, his memoirs are not very revealing, because I think this habit of 50 years of keeping his thoughts to himself, even when he speak freely, is not very revealing. But he was in fact, that second act is equally, if not more important than the first act, than the lifting of the censorship, the abhorrence of violence. And I have a quote there where he says, well, some people, just suggest that I just bang my fist on the table. And he says, in principle, it could be done. But I think literally, that's a quote, but one doesn't feel like doing it. And I think, we and the Russian people are in huge debt to him for this.
The moral dimension of all this, I want to focus in on by talking about something that may seem at first blush irrelevant, but actually was quite important to Russia, and sort of an interesting aspect of the story, and that has to do with alcohol. Now, there are some incredible statistics you have about the importance of alcohol to Russia's economy and to the health of the Russian state. But beyond that, and this was something that was new to me, Gorbachev initiated a reform crusade against alcohol.
Well, essentially, he did not go, prohibition 100%, but severely limited the times when vodka was sold, and also its production, the volume that was produced, and also raise the prices. Well, yes, I by the way, I cite this example as something that precisely sort of to underscore the imperative of moral values over the material being of the state. It was 15% of the state budget. The Prime Minister, Nikolai Ryzhkov, at that time, went to the Politburo and said, "You're killing me." I mean, because the Prime Minister is responsible for the economy. Usually the division of labor was the Prime Minister is responsible for the economy, the General Secretary does really important stuff, political stuff, foreign relations, security. You're killing me. There's, what are you doing? And instead, he received a lecture on how he puts the material interests of the state above the moral health of the people. So I think it's very indicative. I kind of forgot about this. Thanks for reminding me. It's very indicative of Gorbachev's entire attitude.